So, what is involuntary?
An interaction of which is not consensual, an interaction done against someone's own free will choice. This is an interaction against real freedom, as it is telling someone what to do with their own property of freedom, committing theft upon their right to choose how to live their own life. It is backed by violence in its proceeding. An involuntary action is therefore wrong, making a claim upon the property of another, therefore legitimizing an act of slavery. So let's break this down. The last sentence that I just read and just said is kind of detailing how any involuntary action is making a claim upon the legitimacy of slavery. Why is that? It's perhaps because you're doing something that somebody doesn't want done to their own property. So you're saying you get to be the master and determine what happens to their property because you're imposing upon them. You're giving them a condition for them that they don't want for themselves. That is slavery. So that's an involuntary interaction. Now, we can also look at the voluntary side of it too, though, right, Aaron?
Right, right, yeah. Well, I think modernly, many people don't see their behavior, such as, you know, asking for permission for their rights. They don't see these things as involuntary. They think that they're doing them voluntary. But when a behavior is pushed or coerced, or when you make a behavior because you are worried about the consequences of not doing that behavior, you might tell yourself that it's a voluntary action, but in reality it's involuntary and you have no choice. But
Hmm.
we tell ourselves that we do have a choice, because it harshens the blow that we're being enslaved by these methods.
So there's a question as to, are we following our own conscience? Are we still following ourselves, or are we following a authority? So even if it's not, involuntary, are we still respecting our voluntary selves, our own being with our own mind, thinking for ourselves? Are we really thinking for ourselves? So I have a quote from the 19th century abolitionist Ezra Haywood, and he states that slavery is voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary when one sells or yields his or her own person to the irresponsible will of another, and involuntary when placed under the absolute power of another without one's own consent. Okay, so I'll read it one more time. Voluntary when one sells or yields his or her own person to the irresponsible will of another, and involuntary when placed under the absolute power of another without one's own consent. So you can see where voluntary it can get a little tricky because you're selling or yielding your own person to the will of another. And in slavery of the past, I mean, this was a literal deal where you would sell people and say, well, let's put a price tag on them and sell them at an auction. A very scary thing that, you try that nowadays, people are going to look at you and be like, that is completely immoral. It should not be done. Of course, in many parts of the world, because most people understand it's wrong. They recognize human rights. They recognize that the individual being sold does not deserve to be sold. And so people understand, like, yeah, they shouldn't be a slave. Even if that slave wants to be a slave, everybody would say, that person should not be a slave because everybody sees it as wrong. No matter what that person wants it or not, or whether that was imposed or not, people see that interaction within itself as being wrong because somebody is telling someone else what to do with their own property, which that property that they own themselves only belongs with themselves. It's their own body, it's their own life. It can only belong to themselves. They can hire somebody and have help to maintain their own property, but they cannot give away their ownership. They cannot say that that person is entirely responsible for their own property. At the end of the day, only you are truly responsible for your own self, the same way for your own health. Only you can truly heal yourself. Somebody can help you, a doctor can give you this or that, but they don't really know you. You are still interacting with your own body. You feel things, you may know more just because of that. And you are living your day-to-day life. You can't be dependent on this doctor to give you something all the time, every second, and then think about the expenses and all the problems that come with it. You start to realize that dependence is not a healthy way of living. It is one that is always going to be fit in desire and dependence, and one that just always leads to a level of lack of self ownership or the lack of self sustainability, or self reliance, may you say. So, what do you think about this, Aaron? Me reading the quote and talking about what is involuntary, something that's against real freedom, telling someone what to do with their own property. I think the involuntary one is more obvious, and the voluntary one, it's like we might see exceptions where it's like, yeah, we can hire this person, we can have help here or there, but do we have to still be responsible for ourselves? Do we still have to like understand what it is that we own, so that way no one could take that ownership away?
So I think a big point that you mentioned was dependency, and it's natural to seek help from other people. It's natural to get cooperation and get help with things, as long as it's like you said, you're willfully giving this without a threat being made, or a claim being made on your property or rights that you do have. And something with dependency, it becomes no longer voluntary if you're dependent on it, and you can't function without that. uh and that's a big part of what we face too, is that um you know many people are dependent on this system that requires permits, and it has a claim on the your rights and your property. And so, yeah, it all comes down to, right and wrong. Wrong is when you coercion, theft, violence, all of these things. And that's when behavior becomes involuntary, is when you have threats being made, or, coercion.
Yeah, so in our next video, we'll go over what is violence. I encourage people to check that out. And I really like the fact you kind of bring up this idea that's a relationship, because an involuntary interaction is an interaction. You're creating a relationship with somebody. And if you create a dependence related relationship, like you said, if it's based on dependence, you're going to feel like you need to be in that relationship. That like people are going to get used to being in that relationship where you feel like you always have to be dependent because you set yourself up to be dependent, and the person is going to want to stay in that position, and then you set yourself up ultimately for your own enslavement, your own lack of responsibility, unless you understand what you're giving away, unless you understand what it is that you have to trade with somebody, to the point where you say, okay, I still have myself, I still own myself, I'm not giving away any of my own responsibilities. I'm giving away stuff that I know is I can still be responsible for. And so, as long as you have control over your interactions and what you do on a day-to-day basis, your actions and how you interact with others, that will give you a leverage into everything in this world, from building everyday relationships to relationships that can grow too toxic with anybody, or your kids or what have you. Treating them right is going to produce the right results. Right. This is what we talked about before. So join us for what is violence, and we'll go deeper into what it means to violate someone's rights.